In the final years of World War II, as the Third Reich crumbled beneath the relentless advance of Allied forces from the West and the Soviet juggernaut from the East, Adolf Hitler made a decision that would baffle military strategists for generations to come. While his armies desperately needed conventional weapons, tanks, artillery, aircraft, the Führer authorized the expenditure of approximately 3 billion Reichsmarks on a single weapons program, the Vergeltungswaffe 2, the V-2 rocket. To put this in perspective, that same astronomical sum could have produced 17,000 Panther tanks, enough armored divisions to potentially alter the trajectory of multiple fronts. Yet Hitler chose the rocket. This wasn't merely a miscalculation. This was the manifestation of a dictator's psychology colliding with the brutal reality of total war, a collision that reveals the fundamental disconnect between authoritarian obsession and strategic necessity. The V-2 rocket wasn't simply a weapon, it was a statement. A technological marvel decades ahead of its time, it stood as the world's first long-range ballistic missile, capable of reaching the edge of space before descending upon its target at supersonic speeds. No defense existed against it, no warning could be given. It represented the future of warfare, a glimpse into an era where nations could strike enemies from hundreds of miles away with impunity. For Hitler, the V-2 embodied something far more intoxicating than mere military advantage. It represented dominance through technological supremacy. It was the ultimate expression of German engineering genius, proof that the Third Reich could achieve what no other nation had accomplished. In Hitler's increasingly delusional worldview, the V-2 wasn't just another weapon in an arsenal. It was a game changer, a war winner, a tool of psychological terror that would break enemy morale and force capitulation. But this belief was fundamentally disconnected from military reality. By 1943, when V-2 production accelerated to industrial scale, Germany's strategic situation had deteriorated catastrophically. The Wehrmacht had suffered devastating losses at Stalingrad, where an entire army had been annihilated. The Battle of Kursk had shattered Germany's armored offensive capability on the Eastern Front. In North Africa, Rommel's Afrika Korps had been crushed. The skies over Germany were filled with Allied bombers, systematically destroying the industrial base that sustained the Nazi war machine. German armies were retreating on multiple fronts, bleeding men and machines at an unsustainable rate. What they needed desperately was not futuristic wonder weapons, but practical, proven tools of warfare. Tanks to stop Soviet advances, fighters to contest air superiority, U-boats to strangle Allied supply lines, artillery to break enemy offensives. The economics of Hitler's choice reveal its strategic insanity. 3 billion Reichsmarks represented an enormous portion of Germany's remaining industrial capacity and resources. Each V-2 rocket required approximately 12,000 individual components, many machined to extremely tight tolerances. The production process consumed vast quantities of rare materials, high-grade steel, aluminum, copper, electronics components, all of which were in desperately short supply. The liquid oxygen and ethanol fuel required for each launch demanded complex industrial facilities. The guidance systems needed precision instruments and electronic components that could have been used in radar systems, artillery fire control, or aircraft navigation. Most critically, the program absorbed tens of thousands of skilled workers and engineers whose expertise was desperately needed elsewhere in Germany's crumbling war economy. Compare this to what could have been achieved with those same resources. 17,000 Panther tanks would have equipped over 100 armored divisions. These weren't theoretical weapons. The Panther was arguably the finest medium tank of the war, combining excellent armor protection with a powerful 75mm gun and reasonable mobility. On the Eastern Front, where Soviet numerical superiority was grinding down German forces through sheer attrition, those tanks could have formed a mobile reserve capable of counterattacking breakthrough operations. In the West, they could have reinforced the Atlantic Wall defenses or created a powerful operational reserve to contest the inevitable Allied invasion. Panthers didn't require exotic fuels or launch facilities. They could be produced in existing factories by semi-skilled workers. They could be repaired in field workshops. They represented proven, reliable, immediately deployable combat power. Yet Hitler chose the rocket. This decision cannot be understood through conventional military logic. It requires understanding the psychology of a dictator facing inevitable defeat. By 1943, Hitler's mental state had deteriorated significantly from the confident warlord who had conquered most of Europe. He was isolated in his military headquarters, surrounded by yes-men who reinforced his delusions, receiving filtered information that masked the true catastrophic nature of Germany's situation. He slept irregularly, medicated by his personal physician with a cocktail of drugs including methamphetamine. His hands trembled. His temper was explosive and unpredictable.
He had become a man desperately searching for salvation through miracle weapons, wonder weapons, that would somehow reverse Germany's fortunes through technological competence rather than strategic competence. The V-2 program fit perfectly into this delusional framework. It offered the promise of striking back at enemies who were now beyond Germany's conventional military reach. It represented revenge, Vergeltung, against the British cities that had survived the Blitz and were now serving as staging grounds for the coming invasion. It demonstrated that Germany could still innovate, still terrify, still possess weapons that enemies couldn't match. For a dictator whose entire ideology was built on notions of German racial and technological superiority, the V-2 was psychologically irresistible. It allowed Hitler to maintain the fiction that Germany was still winning the technological war, even as it lost the actual war.
The true cost of Hitler's obsession extended far beyond the financial expenditure. The V-2 program created a parallel nightmare that consumed resources, labor, and lives in ways that revealed the darkest aspects of the Nazi regime. To produce these rockets at the scale Hitler demanded, the SS established a vast underground manufacturing complex called Mittelwerk, buried deep within the Kohnstein mountain in central Germany. This wasn't merely a factory, it was a death camp with a production line, a place where the boundaries between industrial ambition and genocidal cruelty dissolved entirely. Tens of thousands of concentration camp prisoners were worked to death in these tunnels, laboring under conditions so horrific that mortality rates exceeded those of many extermination camps. Prisoners died from exhaustion, starvation, disease, and deliberate murder at rates that shocked even hardened SS officers. The human cost of each V-2 rocket tells a story that Hitler never acknowledged and his engineers preferred to ignore. Conservative estimates suggest that more people died producing the V-2 than were killed by its deployment against Allied cities. Each rocket that roared skyward represented not just 3 billion Reichsmarks divided by roughly 3,000 rockets produced, but countless human lives extinguished in service of a weapon that would ultimately prove strategically worthless. The prisoners who assembled these missiles worked in perpetual twilight, breathing air thick with rock dust and chemical fumes, their bodies breaking down under the relentless demands of Nazi production quotas. When workers collapsed, they were replaced. When sabotage was suspected, and it was constant as prisoners desperately tried to undermine the weapons they were forced to build, brutal reprisals followed. Hangings were conducted in the main assembly halls, bodies left suspended as warnings while production continued beneath them. This created a perverse reality that even some Nazi officials found difficult to rationalize. Albert Speer, Hitler's Minister of Armaments and War Production, privately expressed concern about the program's economics and its drain on conventional weapons production. He understood what Hitler refused to accept, that Germany's survival depended not on miracle weapons, but on maximizing production of proven systems. Speer's technocratic mind could calculate that the resources consumed by V-2 production could have yielded not just tanks, but also thousands of fighter aircraft desperately needed to contest Allied air supremacy, or hundreds of U-boats to interdict the Atlantic supply lines keeping Britain in the war. But Speer also understood the political reality of the Third Reich in its final phase. Hitler's word was absolute, his decisions beyond challenge, and his obsession with revenge weapons overrode all strategic considerations. The military effectiveness of the V-2, when objectively analyzed, revealed the weapon's fundamental futility. Between September 1944 and March 1945, approximately 3,000 V-2 rockets were launched, primarily against London, Antwerp, and other Allied-held cities. These attacks killed approximately 9,000 people and caused significant localized destruction wherever they struck. Each impact was terrifying, a supersonic missile descending from the stratosphere without warning, its explosion creating a crater and sending shockwaves through surrounding neighborhoods. The psychological impact was real. Civilians in targeted cities lived with the knowledge that death could arrive without any air raid siren, any chance to take shelter, any warning whatsoever. But from a strategic military perspective, the V-2 achieved nothing substantial. Compare this to what 17,000 Panther tanks could have accomplished on the battlefield. During the Battle of Kursk in 1943, Germany deployed approximately 300 Panthers in their combat debut. Despite mechanical issues, these tanks proved formidable, with their 75mm guns capable of destroying Soviet T-34s at ranges where German tanks were safe from return fire. Panthers became the backbone of German armored forces for the remainder of the war, feared by Allied tankers who recognized their superiority in armor protection and firepower. 17,000 Panthers would have represented a force multiplier of staggering proportions. On the Eastern Front alone, where Germany faced overwhelming Soviet numerical superiority, such an armored reserve could have created mobile defensive capabilities that would have dramatically slowed the Red Army's advance. Each Panther could engage enemy armor effectively, support infantry operations, and serve as a mobile strongpoint around which defensive lines could be anchored. In the West, the impact could have been equally significant. When the Allies landed at Normandy in June 1944, one of the factors that allowed them to break out from the beachhead was Germany's inability to mass sufficient armored reserves quickly enough to contain the invasion. Individual Panther and Tiger battalions fought with devastating effectiveness, destroying Allied tanks at favorable exchange rates and creating serious tactical problems for advancing forces, but there simply weren't enough of them.
Had Hitler's 3 billion Reichsmarks been invested in mass Panther production instead of V-2 rockets, the Normandy invasion would have faced a fundamentally different strategic situation. Hundreds of additional Panthers could have formed armored reserves positioned to counterattack the invasion beaches, potentially driving Allied forces back into the sea, or at minimum creating a prolonged stalemate that would have changed the war's timeline. The V-2's technological sophistication masked its strategic irrelevance. Yes, it was a technological marvel, the ancestor of every ballistic missile and space rocket that would follow. Its guidance systems, engine design, and structural innovations would directly influence Cold War missile programs and eventually put humans on the moon. Wernher von Braun and his team of German rocket scientists would become the foundation of NASA's space program. But in 1944, none of this future significance mattered. What mattered was whether the weapon contributed to Germany's survival as a nation-state, whether it could alter the military balance on the fronts where Germany was bleeding to death. And by this measure, the only measure that should have mattered to a leader fighting for national survival, the V-2 was an abysmal failure. Hitler's decision reveals a fundamental characteristic of authoritarian decision-making under pressure, the replacement of strategic calculation with psychological need. As the war turned irrevocably against Germany, as the industrial might of the United States combined with Soviet manpower and British determination to create an alliance that Germany had no realistic prospect of defeating, Hitler's mind retreated into fantasy. He convinced himself that new weapons, jets, rockets, super heavy tanks, miracle bombs, would somehow reverse military realities that were fundamentally about industrial capacity, manpower, and strategic resources. The V-2 became a talisman, an object of faith rather than a tool of warfare. Its creation satisfied Hitler's need to believe that German genius could overcome material disadvantage, that the will to power could transcend the arithmetic of total war.
The institutional dynamics surrounding the V-2 program reveal how dictatorship warps organizational decision-making and creates incentives for catastrophic resource misallocation. In a functional military hierarchy, weapons programs undergo rigorous evaluation based on cost-effectiveness, strategic utility, and operational feasibility. But the Third Reich by 1943 was not a functional hierarchy. It was a Byzantine power structure where competing agencies, personalities, and ideological factions vied for Hitler's favor, and where the Führer's personal enthusiasms could override all technical and strategic objections. The V-2 program became an arena where Heinrich Himmler's SS, the Wehrmacht's traditional military leadership, and various industrial and scientific interests competed for control, each faction recognizing that Hitler's personal investment in the project made it politically untouchable, regardless of its military merit. Himmler's SS ultimately gained control of V-2 production through the Mittelwerk facility, a move that had nothing to do with military efficiency and everything to do with expanding SS economic power. For Himmler, the rocket program represented an opportunity to demonstrate that his organization could manage complex industrial production, positioning the SS not merely as a police force and military formation, but as a state within the state, capable of running its own armaments industry. The concentration camp labor system that made Mittelwerk possible was central to this vision. It gave the SS complete control over the workforce, eliminated labor costs, and allowed production schedules to be maintained through methods no conventional factory could employ. When prisoners died at rates that would have been scandalous in civilian industry, they were simply replaced with fresh deportees from the camps. The human cost was irrelevant to Himmler's calculations. What mattered was demonstrating SS competence to Hitler and expanding the organization's economic empire. This created a feedback loop that insulated the V-2 program from rational evaluation. Any criticism of the rocket program could be interpreted as criticism of the SS, which by 1943 had become one of the most powerful organizations in the Nazi state. Officers who questioned whether resources might be better allocated to conventional weapons risked being labeled as defeatist, or worse, potential traitors undermining Germany's war effort. Hitler's personal enthusiasm for the weapon created a protective shield around the program that made objective assessment politically dangerous. In this environment, the normal mechanisms that might constrain wasteful military spending, budget reviews, strategic assessments, cost-benefit analyses, simply ceased to function. The V-2 program became a self-perpetuating enterprise justified by the Führer's will rather than its contribution to military victory. The tactical limitations of the V-2 were apparent to anyone willing to examine the weapon objectively. Each rocket carried approximately 1 ton of explosives, a significant payload certainly, but nothing extraordinary by the standards of strategic bombing. A single Lancaster bomber could carry a larger bomb load, could be reused for hundreds of missions, and cost a fraction of what a V-2 required. The V-2's accuracy was abysmal by any standard. Even under ideal conditions, the missile had a circular error probability of several miles. This meant it was fundamentally a terror weapon aimed at cities, incapable of striking specific military targets with any reliability. You couldn't use a V-2 to destroy a specific bridge, factory, or military headquarters. You could only launch it at a general area and hope it landed somewhere that caused damage and fear. Against this, consider the tactical flexibility of 17,000 Panther tanks.
Each Panther represented a mobile weapons platform that could be precisely directed against specific military objectives. Tank commanders could identify enemy positions, maneuver to advantageous firing positions, coordinate with infantry and artillery, and adapt to changing battlefield conditions in real time. A Panther could destroy enemy armor, provide direct fire support against fortified positions, serve as a breakthrough weapon or a defensive strongpoint, depending on operational needs. Panthers could be concentrated at critical points where German lines were threatened, creating local superiority that could defeat enemy offensives or enable German counterattacks. This tactical flexibility, the ability to mass armor where it was needed most, represented exactly the kind of operational capability Germany desperately needed as it fought a multi-front war against enemies with superior numbers. The economic absurdity of the V-2 becomes even more apparent when examining the complete lifecycle costs. Each rocket required not just the manufacturing expense, but also the infrastructure to support operations. Launch sites had to be constructed and constantly relocated to avoid Allied bombing. Liquid oxygen facilities were needed to generate the oxidizer for the rocket engines. Transportation networks had to move these cumbersome missiles from underground factories to launch sites. Specialized crews had to be trained in the complex procedures required to fuel, arm, and launch each rocket. And after all this investment, each V-2 could be used exactly once. 3,000 launches meant 3,000 rockets built and destroyed, each representing an enormous investment in resources and labor that yielded a single explosion and then vanished. Contrast this with tank production economics. Once a Panther rolled off the assembly line, it could serve for months or years depending on battlefield conditions and maintenance. Tanks that were damaged could often be repaired and returned to service. Crews gained experience with their vehicles, improving effectiveness over time. The industrial infrastructure that produced tanks, factories, trained workers, supply chains, represented a sustainable production capability that could continue churning out vehicles as long as raw materials were available. This was the kind of military-industrial investment that made strategic sense for a nation fighting for survival, not one-use missiles that consumed extraordinary resources for limited tactical effect. Hitler's psychology by this point in the war had become completely divorced from the mathematical realities of industrial warfare. He had daily military conferences where he obsessed over the deployment of individual battalions and the technical specifications of weapon systems, but he seemed incapable of grasping the fundamental arithmetic that was destroying Germany. The Soviet Union was producing thousands of T-34 tanks monthly. American factories were building ships faster than U-boats could sink them. British and American bombers were systematically destroying Germany's industrial capacity while their own production accelerated beyond anything Germany could match. In this context, what Germany needed was not technological sophistication, but mass production of reliable, effective weapon systems that could be fielded quickly and maintained under deteriorating conditions. The V-2 represented the opposite of the sensible approach. It was a precision instrument requiring advanced manufacturing capabilities, rare materials, and specialized support infrastructure, exactly the kind of weapon a nation should develop when it has overwhelming industrial superiority and can afford to invest in technological advancement. It was emphatically not the weapon a failing state should build when every resource counted and when survival depended on maximizing combat power per unit of industrial capacity. That Hitler couldn't recognize this fundamental mismatch between Germany's strategic situation and the V-2's resource demands reveals how completely his judgment had been compromised by ego, ideology, and the progressive detachment from reality that characterizes dictators facing defeat. The program's continuation, even as Germany collapsed, speaks to the institutional momentum that develops around dictatorial obsessions. By late 1944, as Allied armies approached Germany's borders and Soviet forces prepared to drive into the Reich itself, the V-2 program continued consuming resources that could have strengthened last-ditch defensive preparations. Rockets were still being launched at London and Antwerp, even as German soldiers on the front lines faced ammunition shortages and fuel shortages that immobilized armor and grounded aircraft. The disconnect was total and absolute. A technological vanity program continued operating at full capacity, while the military forces that might actually defend Germany starved for basic supplies.
The ultimate verdict on Hitler's decision can only be rendered by examining what actually transpired in the war's final months, and considering the counterfactual of what might have been different with 17,000 additional Panther tanks in German arsenals. By January 1945, the strategic situation had become apocalyptic for Germany. The Red Army had launched its Vistula Oder offensive, a massive operation involving over 2 million Soviet soldiers, supported by thousands of tanks and aircraft, smashing through German defensive lines in Poland and driving toward Berlin at speeds that shocked even Soviet commanders. In the West, Allied forces had recovered from the temporary setback of the Battle of the Bulge and were preparing to cross the Rhine into Germany's industrial heartland. German cities were being systematically reduced to rubble by round-the-clock bombing. The Reich was dying, and the V-2 rockets still launching toward Allied cities did absolutely nothing to alter this fundamental reality. Imagine an alternative scenario where those 3 billion Reichsmarks had been invested rationally. 17,000 Panthers would not have prevented Germany's defeat,
By 1943, when this decision was being made, Germany's strategic position was likely already hopeless, given the overwhelming material superiority of the Allied coalition. But those tanks could have fundamentally altered the timeline and human cost of Germany's collapse. In the East, hundreds of additional Panther battalions could have created mobile defensive reserves capable of mounting effective counterattacks against Soviet breakthrough operations. The Red Army's advance, while ultimately unstoppable, could have been significantly slowed, buying months of additional time. Each week that Germany survived meant more time for civilians to flee westward ahead of Soviet forces, potentially saving hundreds of thousands from the rape, murder, and deportation that accompanied the Red Army's advance into German territory. In the West, additional armored reserves could have made the Normandy invasion exponentially more costly for the Allies. The historical D-Day landings succeeded in part because Germany lacked sufficient armored reserves to mount immediate, powerful counterattacks against the beachheads. Panzer divisions that did engage Allied forces fought with devastating effectiveness, but were simply too few and arrived too late to contain the invasion. Hundreds of additional Panthers positioned to respond to an invasion could have created a fundamentally different tactical situation, potentially driving Allied forces back to the beaches, or at minimum creating a prolonged stalemate in Normandy that would have delayed the liberation of France by months. This wouldn't have changed the war's ultimate outcome, but it would have altered its course and potentially its conclusion, particularly if prolonged German resistance had created political pressure in the United States for a negotiated settlement rather than unconditional surrender. The human dimension of this miscalculation extends beyond military casualties. The resources consumed by the V-2 program represented food that could have fed German civilians during the catastrophic final months of the war, industrial capacity that could have produced defensive equipment for cities under aerial bombardment, transportation assets that could have been used to evacuate populations from combat zones. In Hitler's calculus, none of this mattered. The psychological satisfaction of striking back at enemies who were now beyond Germany's conventional reach took precedence over the practical needs of national survival. This represents dictatorship at its most destructive, a single individual's emotional requirements overriding the collective welfare of an entire nation. The V-2 program also exemplifies how authoritarian regimes squander their most valuable resource, human capital. The engineers, scientists, and technicians who developed and produced the V-2 represented some of Germany's most talented minds. Their expertise, if directed toward improving existing weapon systems or solving practical military problems, could have yielded significant operational advantages. Instead, they were consumed by a vanity project that satisfied Hitler's psychological needs but contributed nothing to Germany's survival. Similarly, the skilled workers and concentration camp prisoners who died producing these rockets represented labor that could have been employed in conventional arms production, construction of defensive fortifications, or food production. In an economy already stretched beyond sustainable limits, the V-2 program represented a catastrophic misallocation of the only resource Germany still possessed in reasonable quantities: skilled labor. The long-term historical irony of Hitler's decision adds another layer to this tragedy. The V-2 technology that cost Germany so dearly during the war became the foundation of Cold War missile programs and eventually space exploration. The United States and Soviet Union competed fiercely to capture German rocket scientists and technical documentation at war's end. Wernher von Braun and his team, who had developed the V-2 using slave labor at Middlework, were welcomed into the American space program and became heroes of the space age. The technological sophistication that made the V-2 strategically useless in 1944 became invaluable in the 1950s and 1960s, when intercontinental ballistic missiles and space launch vehicles became crucial strategic assets. But this future significance provided no benefit whatsoever to Nazi Germany in its death throes. Hitler invested in a weapon that would prove revolutionary, but not until decades after his regime had been annihilated. This points to a fundamental principle of military strategy that Hitler either never understood or willfully ignored. Weapons must be matched to strategic circumstances. A technologically advanced weapon that cannot be produced in sufficient quantities, cannot be deployed effectively given available resources, and does not address immediate military needs is worse than useless. It actively harms the war effort by consuming resources that could have been used more effectively. The V-2 was the wrong weapon at the wrong time for a nation in Germany's position. It was a weapon for a dominant power with surplus industrial capacity and the luxury of investing in future capabilities, not for a failing state fighting desperately for survival. The decision reveals the ultimate failure mode of dictatorship, the collapse of feedback mechanisms that might correct catastrophic errors. In a functional decision-making system, multiple voices and perspectives create checks against individual delusion. Military professionals might highlight the tactical limitations of a weapon system. Economists might demonstrate the opportunity costs of resource allocation. Strategic planners might connect industrial decisions to battlefield realities. But in the Third Reich by 1943, all these feedback mechanisms had been systematically destroyed. Hitler tolerated no dissent, surrounded himself with sycophants, and had created an institutional culture where challenging the Führer's judgment was tantamount to treason.
The result was a decision-making process where Hitler's personal enthusiasms and psychological needs drove policy regardless of strategic rationality. The 3 billion Reichsmarks spent on the V-2 program represent more than wasted money. They represent the human cost of unchecked power. Every resource diverted to rocket production was a resource unavailable for Germany's actual defense. Every skilled worker who died in Middle Works tunnels was someone who could have contributed to Germany's survival. Every ton of steel forged into a missile body was steel that couldn't become tank armor. Every hour of engineering expertise devoted to perfecting rocket guidance was an hour not spent improving fighter aircraft or anti-tank weapons. The cumulative effect was a nation that possessed technological marvels, but lacked the basic tools needed to defend itself against the enemies closing in from all sides. Hitler's choice between rockets and tanks ultimately symbolizes the fundamental incompatibility between dictatorial ego and national survival. A rational leader, even one as ideologically committed as Hitler, would recognize that Germany's situation demanded maximizing immediate combat power through proven weapon systems. But rationality requires accepting uncomfortable truths, that Germany was losing, that miracle weapons wouldn't reverse this reality, that survival depended on unglamorous decisions about resource allocation rather than dramatic technological gestures. Hitler's ego couldn't accept these truths. He needed to believe that German genius could overcome material disadvantage, that revenge weapons could break enemy morale, that technological superiority could substitute for strategic impossibility. The V-2 program stands as a monument to this delusion, a 3 billion Reichsmark testament to the catastrophic consequences when dictatorial psychology shapes military strategy. 17,000 Panthers might not have won the war, but they could have made Germany's defeat less absolute, less rapid, and less devastating to German civilians caught in the final collapse. The rockets that streaked toward London and Antwerp accomplished nothing except to demonstrate that Nazi Germany could still build impressive machines even as it ceased to exist as a functional state. They represented technological achievement in service of strategic madness, engineering excellence subordinated to dictatorial fantasy, and ultimately the triumph of one man's psychological needs over an entire nation's survival.